Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Wright.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for their interesting presentations and reflections. In my role as a respondent, I was asked to reflect on the subject of new audiences and challenges and opportunities in the context of our work at the Global Business Initiative on Human Rights. The Global Business Initiative on Human Rights has 18 member companies that are from numerous geographies and industries, many of whom are present in the annual forum, and one of which is Rajiv and Jindal Stainless on the panel here. GBI divides its work in two main ways. One is business-to-business learning on human rights, and particularly the guiding principles. And the second is business and human rights awareness raising, particularly in the emerging and developing markets. And so that's the piece that I will couch my reflections in. We have done outreach events in a number of different countries, including Brazil, Colombia, India, Malaysia, Egypt, and most recently, last month, in Kenya and the UAE. In that regard, we have reached out to approximately 700 business leaders in those markets. And so I will talk briefly about one opportunity and one challenge that we have found, though there are many. One opportunity that we have found is that the context differs. We've heard this from the panelists now. All around the world, different countries have different issues, different ways of talking about human rights and CSR. And while the context differs, there are similar themes and there are similar entry points and hooks in which the business and human rights agenda can be inserted. There are often progressive laws and progressive policies that are being developed in these markets and geographies. And just to give two brief examples, when we were in Kenya in November, a lot of the public discourse was around the new constitution and the new Bill of Rights that had recently come in. And when the public discourse is focusing around those rights issues, it's relatively easy to then start saying, well, what about business? And to have those conversations in that way. So that's one interesting entry point that we found. The second interesting entry point that we have found has been in China last week when we were there, planning a meeting that we are having in April 2013. And the Chinese State Council, which is the cabinet of the government, has announced that social risk assessments will have to be undertaken for all major industrial projects henceforth. And so the point of this one opportunity that I'm raising is that this might be a new audiences panel, but there are interesting business and human rights related policy and law developments that are occurring, that when we hook into them, it's easier to have these conversations. On the challenge piece, and I'm going to somewhat contradict Gwendolyn's comment on the lack of awareness of business and human rights, we find that business and human rights, once you've done the demystifying, that there is a good awareness, both with government and civil society and with business, and potentially even the guiding principles. And the survey that Alex Guaqueta referenced this morning of businesses from all around the world reflected that, that there is a relatively broad awareness of business and human rights and even the guiding principles. What the survey also showed was that when you start to dive a little bit deeper and when you look into, well, what does this mean to implement the guiding principles and what policies and processes, do you have in place, that's where it gets a little bit tougher. And so we've certainly noticed a awareness action gap where it's one thing to have a conversation about business and human rights and the guiding principles and to say, yes, we have a human rights policy and yes, we're a member of an organization that talks about human rights with other actors. But being able to clearly say what it is that you're doing to ensure that you're meeting your responsibility to respect is a more challenging issue we have found. The final thing that I would say to wrap up my response is that the new audiences thing is interesting and linked to my opportunity point. There are new audiences, but this stuff is happening around the world, and there are real business and human rights champions that we have the pleasure of knowing and meeting in all these different geographies. And so identifying those key champions is both a pleasure, but also incredibly important if we want to continue to reach out to these new audiences. Thank you.
Margaret?
Okay, thank you, Per. I'm going to be brief because I want to make sure we leave enough time for the discussion this afternoon, because I expect there's a lot of challenges as well as solutions that are within the audience here. But I just want to share with you one reflection I had as I was listening to the panelists speaking. And that is an image in my head of a bell curve. So, you know, the typical bell curve that goes like that. But Rogers, in the 1960s, he was a famous sociologist. And he developed a bell curve for the way that new innovations and new ideas flow through society. So he started out by saying, okay, it starts with a small group of early innovators, and then it moves up the curve a little bit to the early adopters, and then it moves up to the early majority, and then over the top of the curve to the late majority, and then down to the laggards. And he said this is the way innovations and ideas get transmitted through society, whether they are mobile phones as a new innovation, or whether it's the idea of democracy, and it goes as a normal flow through all human societies. Now, I think about this in relation to the guiding principles, because we have what is essentially a new innovation, a new agreement. It has gone from the innovators, and it has moved to the early adopters. But we're probably at that point of early adopters now. And if you think about what happens after that with the flow of innovations, you know, you need to dramatically ramp up activities in order to get from the early adopters to the early majority. It's an exponential increase in activities. And you also have to move very fast. Roger will teach us that if you don't get over that initial hill very quickly, the idea just gets lost and it gets relegated to the bookshelf of history, no matter how good the idea was. And he also teaches us that within that critical transition phase, that you need to be able to message this so that the audience recognizes, particularly that early majority, that they recognize that this is a clear need, and they need to pick it up, even if it requires a cost or a change in behavior of those actors. You also need to look at what value it presents to the early adopters or the early majority, whether that be in terms of presenting it in incentives or disincentives to them. And I heard all of those reflected in the panel as they were discussing about how we put this in language, how we get ambassadors of change, how we contextualize this. It's really, you're plotting up the Rogers curve here. And this is something that, you know, the UN Working Group on Human Rights in Business, we recognize that dissemination is going to be one of our biggest challenges in getting it out to that early majority. And so we've made it our first work stream in terms of our strategy. So if you look through our strategy, which we released for the Human Rights Council last June, we said, you know, in terms of dissemination, it's getting it out to those new actors that is going to be our critical focus in dissemination. And in terms of the vehicle that we will use, we're going to use what we call multipliers. So that's where you can reach hundreds or thousands of these new actors in one go, whether that's through industry sector organizations, whether that's through networks of national human rights institutions, whether that's through regional organization of states, or whether that's through the very top on our list is the UN Global Compact as being one of those groups that is a critical multiplier, and it has the reach through the local networks, and it already has the messaging down. It's already dealing with this critical aspects of dissemination that we have to get right in order to reach that early majority and make it over that critical part of the curve. So that's just to let you know that in the very near future, we'll be approaching you via the local networks, via the way we message this through a number of different activities to where we can actually get some synergies so that we can get the traction we need to make that exponential leap up the hill. And just to close, I have to apologize with the changes in schedule. I'm actually supposed to be taking a different session this afternoon. So in terms of closing, I will leave you now. But we do have people who are frantically taking notes on our behalf. So we'll still be able to get some of the important learnings that you'll share back into the working group. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Margaret. Before coming back to the panelists to comment on my concluding remarks, let me call on a few speakers who have. Okay. All right, so let me start with civil society, including trade unions, academics, etc. Stephen Oates, SAI. Please, can you introduce your organization? Stephen Oates.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes. Can you stand up? Yes.
I represent Social Accountability International, a multi-stakeholder initiative. I hadn't intended to speak, but you seem to insist that you wanted...
I'm sorry, Stephen. We can't hear you. We can't see you.
Well, my microphone is on, Chair. Can you hear?
I can hear you now, but
I can see you, so you must at least be able to see me. Thank you for forcing me to put my name down. And there is one point that I do want to make, having listened to all of the speakers, all of whom were interesting and informative in their ways. But there is a point here which is bothering me a lot, and that is precisely what you just mentioned in passing, which is trade unions and workers' organizations, because I don't see them present here. I went to a side event meeting this morning. There were 20 people there for the trade union issue. To my mind, this is a huge gap. They may not be what you call new audiences for the principles of human rights and the fundamental rights at work, which are what we're aiming at in all of the guiding principles and in the compact. But they are certainly an essential part of it, and I do not see how you can talk about worker rights without having an engagement with worker organizations. In the things that I do with social accountability and what I see in the CSR field, including from the ILO side, is that it is becoming less and less easy to find that dialogue with the trade unions, which don't have the resources, for understandable reasons, to participate in meetings such as this one, perhaps as they might want to. In the whole ISO 26000 process, for example, out of 6 stakeholder groups, Labour was consistently the most underrepresented, despite the sterling work which its representatives did do. This is a concern to me, and it's a concern also that they are not present and the Labour issue is not addressed so much here. So I wonder if you could say how you see that, or do you see trade unions as not part of the picture so much anymore? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, well, let me take 2 other comments, and then we will address the 3 questions at the same time. Bert Fokema Ipieka, oil and gas industry.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to make a comment in the spirit of the title, the new audiences, and I'd say that yes, indeed, big industry and oil and gas in particular have had a long history in working on human rights. We were front and center of the human rights dialogue when it started maybe 15 years ago, and as an industry association, we've continued to help our members looking at what is human rights to the industry and what can members do to develop their ideas. The guiding principles were just another marker in a journey to that extent to our industry, but it did require us to recalibrate our approach. So we are in a 3-year program which will produce guidances for oil and gas industries, and all of that guidance will be available publicly. So also the new audiences and maybe even other industries will find that they might pick up something from those materials. I think I'd like particularly to show the one, and I've got them here, that is about community grievance mechanisms, because there's a lot of talk always about what do we do with complaints, and certainly became clear from the Malawi presentation as well. And as an industry, our experience is that really solving those issues very early on, preventing them from escalating, and solving them locally is the approach to take. And this booklet, which is a synthesis of all the existing guidance out there, is taking that approach. I'd also like to say, in terms of newcomers, a comment on the presentation from China, which was starting to talk about language. And when we look inside our organizations, I actually don't work for IPIC, I work for Shell, the oil company. I'm the human rights coordinator in Shell. And when I work inside my own company, and I hear the same from others, the language that we use here, where we exactly know the difference between duty and responsibility, and we really get very excited over it, it just does not appeal to project managers who have to implement this. So finding operational language and mapping the human rights and guiding principles language onto operational language is something that's really important if you want to get tractions. And I wouldn't be surprised if that same applies to small and medium-sized enterprises, that we just use the wrong words. But if we find the right words, they probably come on board. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin Slater, China Labor Watch.
China Labor Watch is an organization that does just what it says. Its title says we monitor Chinese factory conditions. I want to kind of jump off of what the last civil society representative just said. He mentioned that trade unions haven't really been as much in the conversation as we might like. And I think in the context of China, at least, I'm not going to speak for all countries, but in the context of China, one of the main reasons is because labor unions, independent labor unions, are pretty much non-existent. There's not a lot of freedom. And kind of moving on from there, this brings the question I want to ask. This brings me to the question I want to ask. Two of our panelists today talked about how there's not really a willingness in the country and there's not a capacity to get things moving, and it's moving slowly. And I would say that organizations like ours and many other civil society organizations are supporting in-country efforts to build up the civil society so that it can happen organically, it can happen from the grassroots. But at the same time, that process takes years. And all of our efforts here are helping that, but it does take years. In the meantime, there's going to be more abuse, and there's going to be more problems, and it's going to continue. And so for those people that are going to be the victims of that abuse, I wonder why it is that the conversation is usually with the new audience in the country, the target country, and not in the home country. And what I mean by that is the only audience we're talking about in the home country often is the high-level government, but there's different actors within the government that can be seen as a new audience. And this morning, Michael Posner talked about how within the U.S. government there were legislators that recently were passing bills to get companies in certain countries to report back on what they're doing in that country. They have monitoring from the home country. And so that's also a new audience, people within the home government that are willing to put pressure on their own corporations that are going elsewhere. And there is a will in the home country, there is capacity in the home country, and that's something we can do now. And it's not something we need to wait on while we're building up the capacity within the target country. Thank you.
Okay, and I have a last intervention from Mr. Lazaro Anagua from Tupac Amaru.
I'm sorry, why it's not the translation to French to Spanish?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. But we should take the question to the organizers.
It is discrimination for the indigenous people.
Absolutely.
No, my statement is, I'm sorry. Among the 100 largest transnational corporations ranked by foreign assets, 19% have their headquarters in highly developed countries as United States of America, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, European Union, Canada. Whole, only 4 companies are satellite developing countries. Over the 30 of global capital in the form of foreign direct investment was held by this giant monstrous transnational corporation which have total asset $3 trillion, for 40% of which invested outside of the countries of origin. On this basis of these values, the giant General Electric of the United States of America again held the top position in the world. As a result of the liberalization of the regime of the hiring of transnational capital, foreign direct investment increased from 1990 to 43, according to the above mentioned report. More 60 countries introduced changes in this legislation on the treatment of foreign capital in order to create more favorable conditions for investment foreign capital. Conclusion. What is the conclusion? Today, the humanity needs to establish the code of conduct to regulate the transnational corporation is the transnational financial bank. It is only solution. Other solution not existed because the behavior, the regulation established what the Human Rights Commission is failed, not existed. This problem, the code of conduct has been put it in 64 by the High Commission of the ECOSOC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so we have just a few minutes to wrap up. So I will ask the panelists if you want to add the last few words, and then after that we'll wrap up. Let's start. Yes, let's start with you. Liu.
Yeah, I agree. When we talk the business human rights, the labor organization is very important. Especially, I just say, especially in developing countries like China, maybe including other countries, the workers very difficult to organize themselves. So, how to let the work involved in the process promote the business and human rights is very important. But in China, actually, it's very difficult because although we have the world the biggest trade union in China. There's 130 million membership of the ACFTU, but actually it's only affiliated to government. We cannot see in every year in China there is more than 1 million labor dispute, more than 10,000 this strike and collective action in China. We cannot see any this action or dispute represented or protected by trade union. So I think the international trade union can do more, especially in China. Yeah. And maybe you also know, China also emerged some the labor NGO. But all this labor NGO is very small, and the capacity is very weakness. It's weaknesses. It's very difficult to deeply involve in the process of the promote business human rights. I think how to cooperation between the private sector or international community, especially international trade union, to do something in China. It's very important. But so far, I see very few international trade union to do something in China. Thank you.
Okay.
Quick one. Yeah, I just thought I could make a comment about the the engagement with the industry. I do want to send the wrong message. I strongly believe there are a number of big companies that are very willing to engage with CSOs and governments, but there are junior mining companies that have total disregard for the GPs, for primary legal documents, and for international instruments. Those are the ones that I was making reference to. And I think the second one as well is about the awareness about the GPs and business and human rights. I think at the international level, there is that consensus. People know about these things. But when you go to the grassroots level, people, communities that are impacted by these multinational corporations, they don't know what these rights are all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Williams.
Very quickly, actually, I was wondering why there was no conversation around reporting. Reporting is a big challenge, actually. And I purposely left it at the end. And just to also mention, in the morning, Alex did make a statement that in the survey, this point came out very clearly about reporting. And in India, the stock exchanges now have made it a mandatory requirement for the top 100 companies of India to report on issues relating to sustainability, more importantly, as per the framework, GRI guidelines, and touch upon labor and touch upon human rights in a very major way. That's one step which we have just about taken, and I think other countries will also be following shortly, but we in India it's become a mandatory requirement from March 2013. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to wrap up more about the GPs on human rights, yes. Mainly because they are considered as excellent material, excellent tool to be a basis. But of course, much effort is needed now in the next phases of its implementation, its embedding, its adopting by the companies, by all the people, so in general to become a part of all of us. Thank you.
Yes.
About the trade unions in Brazil, they are passing through a big change of priorities. After the election of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, they don't need more to fight so strongly by financial gains. They started to dialoguing about the social changes in the country. For example, a strong trade union, the Central Única of Workers, has a social observatory. But I agree with Steve that we need to invite them to dialogue about human rights more frequently. Thank you.
Okay, Gwendolyn. 1 minute. Just to conclude.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to restate the point that has been made, I think, in many ways. It's not about multinational companies. I think they have a great awareness on the guiding principles, but I think we also have to focus on the small and medium-sized enterprises and develop an understanding of what the guiding principles can be about in smaller business contexts.
Right.
Just quickly, I would say that it's very enthusing to hear from Heloisa Itaipu, to hear from Titan Group, and to hear from Jindal Stainless about the work that they're doing to implement the guiding principles. And there are a lot of challenges ahead, and there's a lot of hard work to be done, but it's been a pleasure to hear them today talking about that, and to hear from the NGOs about their work on this agenda as well.
Okay. There are 3 remarks that I would like to make and to leave with you. We will not have the answer immediately. The first one is, it is true that human rights in business is not new. I mean, I remember I used to be the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 1992 to 2001, so for 10 years. For 10 years, I attended Davos and interacted with leading business people, business companies, but also attended the whole series of meetings. Oil and gas is one organized by big companies to discuss business and human rights. What is new is now that we have a United Nations document which takes the issue of responsibility at the same level for everybody. So it is not anymore codes and voluntary, etc., that companies used to develop. Now they have something to start their work, something that brings all the companies together in terms of their responsibilities. So the large corporations have been part of this exercise. When we started Global Compact in 2000, members of the board were the big corporations. I think where we broke maybe the chain is on the supply chain, is maybe by not insisting enough with large companies that they also have responsibility when it comes to their suppliers and their distributors. We should never forget the distributors. Because if the companies exercise that responsibility with the suppliers worldwide, then we can reach quickly to most of the small and medium-scale enterprise. Now, it is not an easy task. It is very difficult because you have issues of national law, international standard, you have issues of corruption, issues of competition, etc., etc. But to me, it seems to me that this is the way to go to reach out to as many companies as possible, is starting with the big companies who have thousands of suppliers, and to promote the guiding principles and the various codes together. The second is about trade unions. On the board of the Global Compact, trade unions are represented. I think we have 2 or 3 representatives of trade union, 2 or 3 representatives of civil society organizations, and all the rest is business, because Global Compact is an initiative by business together with the United Nations in order to promote 4 core principles: human rights, labor laws, environment, and anti-corruption. So trade unions are part of that. Now, why is it that they are not in this meeting as opposed to maybe they are in the other room? I have no idea. But trade unions have been a partner with this. And I must say we have this artificial divide between human rights and labor rights. Labor rights are human rights, and therefore when we divide this set of rights, it's like when you divide civil political rights from economic, social, and cultural rights. Of course, then you end up with problems of implementation and problems of targeting the key actors, because labor is defending human rights of workers. And we're all interested in defending the human rights, but not just of the workers, of everybody, the workers, their wives, their children, and their neighbors. The third one is about language, and this is, I think, challenging. We heard from, I think it's the gentleman from oil and gas, Mr. Fokema. Is he still here? Oh, okay, so I can criticize him, I will then. He said that if we want to bring change in the company, especially in the managers, etc., we should use the language of the managers as opposed to using the language of human rights. I don't agree with that. I think that when, that's not what he said. He didn't mean it that way. Okay, so you want to defend him? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Martina Timmerman. I'm now working for the corporate sector, but I used to work for the UN before on human rights and ethics. And when I changed my location and profession, no, not the profession, but my employer, let me put it that way, I learned a lot. And today I can really see that there is, you may use the same words, but there is a different experience in the back of your of your head, and which makes communication and mutual understanding a bit difficult once in a while. So when he talked, he was referring to, let's say, meetings within a company where people say, talk about human rights. But when I was asking the questions only recently, please, can you tell me what you think human rights are? I got a big problem afterwards within the company that I was doubting the competence of the people, but they couldn't give me any response. And that was one of the big companies. So this is why I say he would like to have a wording, you know, where all speak the same language and use terms they both understand.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what human rights education is for. And that is why it is very important to introduce at a very early stage human rights education everywhere, so that everybody will understand the language of human rights. Because if each company comes with its own language, then they cannot talk to each other, they cannot talk to civil society organizations, they cannot talk to governments. I think there is one universal language of human rights. And when we talk about dissemination of the guiding principles, translation of the guiding principles, so that people understand what it means when we talk about responsibility, when we talk about duty, when we talk about due diligence, so that they understand exactly what it means, and then it helps them create a new reality, create new mechanism, or adjust to the new order. Okay, well, thank you very much for your participation. I hope you found the experiences useful, and that you will continue to engage with business or NGOs, whichever part you belong to, and labor, well, we'll go and look for them and make sure that they are here next time.